Well, hello there, young people. We are doing our first reading quiz when we're back from break. Get excited. All right, couple things. Number one, this is a war article. It's about this war that I call it the 7 Years' War. You might call it the French and Indian War. It's called the 7 Years' War because it lasted for 9 years. I'll wait for the laughter to die off. And I keep looking to my picture in the screen because I look so weird. I look so much better today. I hope I got a haircut. Ooh. All right, French and Indian War. Here we go. Throughout the 18th century, various European powers competed for control of the North American continent. England established permanent colonies along the East Coast, building settlements and establishing farms. France claimed lands in modern-day Canada and along the Mississippi River, trading European goods with indigenous peoples for valuable furs. But as time went on, things grew tense between these competing powers. Great Britain and France both wanted more land, especially land in the fertile Ohio River Valley. Hey, that's us. And both countries wanted to spread their influence and culture across the North American continent. But none of the land in North America was truly uninhabited. For centuries, powerful indigenous groups lived and hunted in the Ohio River Valley and across North America. Hendrick, a Mohawk leader, summarized the struggle of the French and Indian War from an indigenous or Native American perspective. The governor of Virginia and the governor of Canada are quarreling about lands which belong to us, and their quarrel may end in our destruction. Would North America be dominated by the fur trading French? Or would British colonists and their families turn the land into permanent settlements? And how would the powerful indigenous communities promote their interests against these European powers in the land they had inhabited for centuries? The fate of the conflict, or the fate of the continent, would soon be decided as the tensions turned into a full-blown conflict, the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War changed North America and the world forever. But before we get to that, let's dive deeper into the conflict. Here we go. There's a picture of this. Following the Battle of Jumonville Glen, Washington and his men built a fort nearby to establish their position. They called it Fort Necessity. Today, the Fort Necessity National Battlefield preserves the site of the Battle of Fort Necessity. Look at that awesome fort. That looks pretty big. The war, alliances and battles. George Washington, a fledgling colonial officer fighting for the British, and Tanagrishan, a skilled Haudenosaunee leader. I looked up how to say that word before making this video. Haudenosaunee, Tanagrishan. Yeah. And Tanagrishan, a skilled Haudenosaunee leader, led the first attacks by the British at the Battle of Jumonville Glen near present-day Pittsburgh. After just 15 minutes of gunfire, Washington and Tanagrishan defeated the French. The first skirmish of the French and Indian War was a success for the British, but they soon learned that the war would be long and difficult. Following the Battle of Jumonville Glen, Washington and his men built a fort nearby to establish their position. They called it Fort Necessity. On July 3rd, 1754, the French attacked. After a long day of fighting and pouring rain, Washington surrendered. It would be the only surrender of his military career. The British continued to struggle through the first phase of the war, in part because they were fighting wars in Europe and North America at the same time. The French and Indian War was a part of a larger global struggle for world supremacy between Great Britain and France, known as the 7 Years' War. Both countries wanted to increase their political and economic power across the globe, and both believed that gaining territory in North America was an important part of this goal. As a result of these other wars, British resources were spread thin. Also, many indigenous groups initially sided with the French in the conflict, including the Lenape, Ojibwe, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Menominee. Often these alliances grew out of previous trade relationships. France's indigenous allies proved invaluable for their early success in the war. The turning point came when British statesman William Pitt took control of operations in 1757. Pitt believed that control of North America was essential for British global dominance, so he fought to get more resources for the British Army in North America. Pitt relied on local authorities in North America to recruit soldiers and gather supplies. In return, he promised to reimburse them for their efforts when the war was over. Pitt also committed more British troops, poured more money into the war, and replaced old generals. He was so confident his strategy would lead to a British victory, he declared, "I am sure I can save this country and nobody else can." Again, that's a British guy saying that. It's William Pitt. In addition, as the war dragged on, British leaders realized the vital importance of establishing more alliances with the indigenous peoples. In 1758, the British negotiated the Treaty of Easton with the chiefs of 13 indigenous groups, including the powerful, Haudenosaunee. Okay, so anytime that you run into a word that you don't know, and I'm your teacher, this is what you do. You highlight it, and for the love of God, please have text to speech. Haudenosaunee. Well, we're gonna copy, paste. It's like you're all in a spellbook practice now. Sorry, kids. This is what we do at Spellbowl.
SpeechModification.com presents how to pronounce Iroquois and Haudenosaunee.
Oh, Haudenosaunee. Haudenosaunee. I'm not editing this. I just know that mistakes happen. All I know is I hate it when kids say, I'm not reading that word because I don't know. That's why I don't like it. You can just use your resources, and I just showed you how. Let's get it right, though.
Modification.com presents how to pronounce Iroquois and Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee. Haudenosaunee. Haudenosaunee. All right, back to the article. In return for help against the French, the British promised to return large blocks of land to the indigenous peoples and recognize their rights to hunting goods in the Ohio River Valley. They also agreed to refrain from establishing colonial settlements west of the Allegheny Mountains following the war. These actions worked. The indigenous leaders believed the British would honor their promises, so many of the indigenous groups that were allied with the French in the Ohio Valley stood down. This left the French force isolated. The French surrendered Fort Duquesne in November 1758, effectively abandoning the Ohio Valley to the British. In 1759, the French surrendered Quebec after a 3-month siege and naval blockade that ended in a battle outside the city. In 1760, the British captured Montreal. France was also suffering defeats in Europe and India. French officials knew they could not win the war and wanted to negotiate for peace. On February 10th, 1763, both parties signed the Treaty of Paris. The war was officially over. As a result of the treaty, the British gained control of some land in North America, including the land in the Ohio River Valley. France's defeat set the continent on a new path. British colonists would rule the land with permanent settlements and large farms. The lands that had been dominated by the French fur trade were set on a new path. Alliances with the indigenous peoples were vital to Britain's success. But after the war, the relationship between the British and the indigenous people deteriorated. Many British colonists held grudges against the indigenous groups that sided with the French. They sought revenge with brutal campaigns against indigenous peoples, including women and children. And British colonists did not want to keep the promises they made their allies. So, post-war problems. The British won the war, but their victory brought more trouble. Following the peace treaty, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763. This proclamation prohibited colonists from settling on lands acquired from the French in the French and Indian War. The proclamation honored promises made in the Treaty of Easton, but many colonists were angry that after years of war, they could not expand into the Ohio River Valley. Also, the war had been extremely expensive for the British. Soon they tried to recover some of the money they had spent fighting the war by taxing the colonists. These taxes frustrated many colonists who felt they had already done their part to contribute to British success. It would seem that William Pitt's strategy to spend more on the war would have consequences for years to come. A little more than a decade later, the colonists' anger would lead to the American Revolution. And this time, the outcome would be very different for Great Britain. So again, answer those questions to the best of your ability. If you do hit submit and you're not happy with the score, go back, check what you got wrong. If you got something wrong from the article, use the article to help you get the correct answer. And then if you missed anything with the colonies or the geography, just know that I'm going to switch those numbers around. Don't memorize the numbers, memorize the location of the colonies. And with that, we are now rolling into U.S. history. At the beginning of it, this war was the kickoff. Here we go. Speaking of kickoff, I hope the 49ers beat the Vikings tonight. Let's see if I was right. Oh, that was anti.